I nearly died on an operating table, yet my family stayed at my sister's engagement party. Months later, when they needed me, I was already gone. After they removed the hospital wristband, I had a pale ring around my wrist for several weeks. Sometimes I notice myself stroking that region, searching for something that is no longer there. It's amazing how even the tiniest physical reminders may survive the most severe emotional pain. Or perhaps it is the other way around. My name is Julia Matthews, and I nearly died on Thursday. It began 4 months before that Thursday with what I assumed was simply stress. Working as a marketing director for a pharmaceutical business in Boston required hard hours and continual pressure. So when my stomach ached, I blamed it on too much coffee and little sleep. By the time the agony got unbearable, I'd convinced myself it wasn't serious. The irony was not lost on me that I worked for a firm that manufactured diagnostic technology, yet couldn't diagnose my own worsening health. Sophie, my younger sister, was always the center of attention in our family. She'd graduated from Harvard, worked at a famous financial firm in Manhattan, and was newly engaged to James, whose family controlled half of Connecticut. My parents, John and Catherine Matthews, had spent the previous 7 months organizing Sophie's engagement extravaganza, as if it were a royal wedding. Since March, all I'd heard about was the botanical garden setting, the live orchestra, Sophie's commissioned designer dress, and the guest list that read like a Forbes magazine directory. Every Sunday dinner at my parents' Cambridge home became a planning session, with me nodding along while my mother obsesses about centerpiece arrangements and my father debates wine choices. "Julia, you're definitely coming," my mother had stated during one of these dinners, without really asking the question. "Sophie is looking forward to seeing you." Of course, I answered by moving food about my plate as my stomach clenched. I would not miss it. The gala was slated on December 1st. My body had already booked my emergency surgery for the same night. But I had no idea. The ache had become worse during October. I'd seen my doctor twice. The first time she mentioned it may be stress-related, she recommended acid reflux medication. The second time she requested an ultrasound. It revealed something wrong in my appendix but was not definite. She had sent me to a specialist, but the earliest appointment possible was 4 weeks out. She advised me that if the agony became intolerable, I should visit the emergency room. Do not wait. I had nodded, received my medicines, and returned to work. Looking back, I see how idiotic that was. However, when you are living in the circumstance, everything appears doable until it isn't. I had taken ibuprofen like candy and continued to attend meetings, answer to emails, and pretend everything was normal since admitting otherwise felt like admitting weakness. My boyfriend Ethan had observed that I wasn't eating much. We'd been dating for 3 years, living in my Back Bay apartment, and he was worried enough to advise I press harder for answers. But Ethan, an architect who travels frequently for work, had departed for a job in Seattle the week before the gala. We chatted on the phone, and I downplayed how terrible things had gotten because I didn't want him to be concerned from 2,500 miles away. The morning of December 1st began horribly. I had woken up at 5 a.m. I had spent 25 minutes in the bathroom trying not to puke because the agony was so acute. Despite the frigid weather in December, I was sweating when I got dressed for work. I phoned in sick, which I seldom did, and spent the day curled up on my sofa, a heating pad pressing against my side. Around 3 p.m., my mother called. "Julia, please tell me you're getting ready," she said without explanation. "The gala starts at 7, and you know how your sister reacts when people arrive late." "Mom, I truly am not feeling well." My voice had sounded softer than I had meant. "I guess I might have to miss tonight." The quiet on the other end was so long that I checked to be sure the call hadn't been dropped. My mother eventually said, "You're joking." Her tone had become cold. "Julia, this is your sister's engagement gala. She had been preparing this for months. I understand, but I'm in a lot of agony. I've been having stomach problems, and they're becoming worse today. You've always been overly theatrical about being sick." My mother's comments sliced through the phone like a razor. "Remember when you thought you had mono in high school and it turned out to be a cold? Or when you feared you'd fractured your ankle on that ski vacation, only to discover it was a sprain? Mom, this is different. It's always different with you, Julia. You have some pain, and it quickly escalates into a medical emergency." She sighed, the irritated sound she'd mastered over years of what she saw as my overprotectiveness. "Take some Tylenol and get yourself together. Your sister needs you to be there. We all do. Don't disgrace us by being the lone family member that fails to show up." The guilt hit me quickly, as I'm sure she intended. My mother always knew which buttons to press, and the "don't embarrass the family" button was her favorite. "I'll try," I answered faintly. "You will do more than try." Be there by 6:30. We need photographs before the visitors come. She hung up before I could react. I sat there clutching my phone, feeling the agony pulse through my abdomen in waves, and wondering whether she was correct. Maybe I was being overly dramatic. Maybe this was simply a horrible day. I'd pushed through it for a few hours. Sophie was my only sibling. Despite our differing routes in life, and despite the fact that my parents plainly preferred her accomplishments over mine, she was still my younger sister. By 6 p.m., I persuaded myself I could do it. I dressed in the cocktail dress I'd purchased expressly for the gala, carefully applied makeup to conceal my pale complexion, and hired a rideshare to drive me to the botanical gardens. Every bump in the road shot new spikes of anguish through my torso, but I breathed through them. I have to agree, the venue was stunning. Thousands of small lights were hung throughout the greenhouse, transforming it into something out of a fairy tale. Sophie looked gorgeous in her champagne-colored gown, and James stood next to her, looking rightly proud. My parents had been holding court near the entryway, welcoming visitors with a social elegance honed over years of experience. "Julia, finally," my father had exclaimed when he noticed me. "We were beginning to suspect you'd skipped your own sister's party." "I told you she'd come," my mother said, air kissing both of my cheeks. "Though you do appear pale, sweetheart. You should use the restroom before taking pictures." I'd made it through the formal family portraits, despite having to lean against a pillar between shoots. I'd made it through the first hour of the gala, sipping a glass of ginger ale and avoiding the catering tables since the mere notion of eating made me nauseated. I'd even made it through my mother introducing me to many of James' family acquaintances, whose names I'd quickly forgotten since the anguish had begun to block out everything else. Around 9 p.m., I located my mother near the bar. "Mom, I need to go home. Something is horribly wrong." She'd stared at me with barely veiled annoyance. "Julia, we haven't even finished the toast yet. Could you kindly hang on for another hour?" "I do not think I can. The agony is worsening." "Then sit somewhere quiet for a while. There is a seat in the orchid room, but you definitely cannot go until Sophie and James have cut the cake. It would destroy her." I attempted to argue, but my mother had already turned away to welcome another person, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. The orchid room had been vacant and pleasantly cold. I sat on the bench my mother had advised, slightly leaning forward since it hurt less than sitting upright. Through the glass walls I could see the celebration continue. The orchestra performed. Everyone laughed and danced. Sophie shined at the center of it all. Around 9:15, the discomfort peaked. I'd been breathing through the pains 1 second, and the next, something had exploded inside me, turning the entire world white with anguish. I attempted to rise up and instantly fell. I can't recall much after that. Fragments return sometimes, generally at 3 a.m. when I am unable to sleep. The chill of the tile floor on my cheek. Someone is crying for aid. I could taste copper in my mouth as I was put onto a stretcher. The greenhouse's roof spun above me as they rolled me through the crowd. Later, far later, one of Sophie's pals described what the scene looked like from the outside. I had been laying on the orchid room floor in a pool of blood. My champagne dress became scarlet as paramedics worked tirelessly to stabilize me. The entire event had come to a standstill. Guests rushed around, eager to see what was occurring. Someone had phoned 911, and my parents were outraged at the inconvenience. According to this friend, who was shocked enough by their reaction to remember it clearly, my mother had said, "Could she really not have held on until after the cake cutting?" I'd been rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital, where doctors discovered that my appendix had not just ruptured, but had been slowly leaking for days, filling my abdominal cavity with infection and internal bleeding. I required emergency surgery immediately. My situation was bad enough that the surgical team momentarily wondered whether it was too late. The procedure had lasted 5 hours. I had flatlined twice on the surgical table. The surgeon subsequently told Ethan, who had boarded the first aircraft back from Seattle, that I was on the verge of death due to septic shock and blood loss. My family was at the botanical gardens when I was bleeding out in the surgery room. The gala proceeded after the ambulance left. My parents had said that I had a medical episode but was being treated, and then they continued with the planned program. The toast was made. The cake was sliced. The orchestra had performed till midnight. That night, none of my family members had visited the hospital. I awoke 40 hours later in the ICU, intubated and hooked up to so many devices that I looked like something out of a science fiction film. Ethan had been sleeping in the recliner next to my bed. When I opened my eyes, he called for the nurse and held my hand while I attempted to figure out what had occurred. My folks paid me a visit on the 3rd day. I had been moved to a regular room by then, but I was still in a lot of pain and on 4 antibiotics. They came at 3 p.m., with my mother carrying a modest bouquet of cheap flowers. "Julia, thank God you're all right," my mother exclaimed, placing the flowers on the ledge. "You gave us quite a scare." My father had stood at the entrance, appearing uneasy in the manner that people do when faced with disease. The doctor added, "You're going to make a full recovery." I glanced at them, my head still blurry from pain medication, but clear enough to notice the lack of genuine care in their words. "You didn't come," I said. My throat had become sore from the breathing tube. "I nearly died. And you didn't come. The doctor informed us that you were in surgery, and there was nothing we could do." My mother responded by arranging the flowers needlessly. "It seems more feasible to stay with Sophie. She was quite upset about what had transpired. I am devastated that I destroyed her party." "Do you mean my mother's look has hardened? That is unjust. Your sister was really concerned about you. But certainly, Julia, your timing was quite poor. Do you have any clue how much the gala cost? How many significant persons were present?" James's parents were appalled by the pandemonium. I felt a fracture inside me. Something that had presumably been breaking for years before splitting entirely at that instant. "I nearly died." "But you didn't," my father had said, his tone implying that we should all be thankful and go on. "The doctor rescued you. Everything turned out great. There is no need to be overly theatrical about it." "Melodramatic?" There was the word again. "I need you to leave," I murmured gently. "Julia, do not be childish." My mother had begun, but I interrupted her. "Yes, both of you." They exchanged glances, and I noticed my mother's jaw tighten in the way it does when she is upset but tries to seem calm. "Fine. Come back when you're feeling more sensible. Clearly, the drug is affecting your emotions." After they went, I sobbed for the first time since I awoke. Ethan had held me as gently as he could without upsetting any of my tubes or wires, and I'd cried into his shoulder until I was fatigued enough to fall asleep. Sophie texted me 4 days after her surgery. "Mom said, 'You're awake. Glad you're okay. Sorry the timing of everything was so awful. Not sorry I nearly died. Not sorry she hadn't visited. Sorry about the timing.' As if my medical emergency had been an inconvenient scheduling conflict. I stared at that text for a long time before deleting it without responding. Megan, my best friend from college, had traveled up from New York twice to pay me a visit. I had been in the hospital for 9 days in all, and Ethan had stayed with me whenever he wasn't required to wash or sleep at home. Several co-workers had sent cards and flowers, but my parents hadn't returned, and Sophie hadn't paid me a visit. On the day I was discharged, my mother called while Ethan was helping me get dressed in actual clothes instead of a hospital gown. "Your father and I think you owe Sophie an apology," she'd announced, and I nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me." Her engagement, gala, was intended to be the highlight of her year, Julia, but the entire evening ended up being about you and your medical problems. Several guests left early, and the photographer couldn't get all of the images Sophie wanted due to the ambulance and police cars outside. "I was dying, Mom, and I apologize for interrupting the party. You've always had to make everything about you, even as a child, and you couldn't stand it when Sophie got attention." James's mother had been asking invasive questions about our family's health history, which was embarrassing. The medicine fog had lifted enough for me to understand exactly what she was saying, and not saying. "You're correct," I'd said, my voice flat. "And I apologize for nearly dying at an inconvenient moment. It will not happen again." "That is more like it. I am delighted you are finally being rational about this. We'll invite you around for supper after you've recovered and we can all get over this unpleasantness." "Sure, Mom. I'll let you know when I'm feeling up to it." I hung up and glanced at Ethan, who had been standing there with my shoes in his hands and absolute wrath on his face. Did she really just? He'd started, but I'd nodded my head. "I need you to drive me home. We can talk about it later." Ethan had helped me up the stairs, gotten me settled on the couch with pillows and blankets, made sure I had my medications, water, and everything I might need within reach, and then sat beside me, careful not to jostle me. "What are you going to do?" he had asked. I'd been thinking about that question since my parents' hospital visit, but the phone call had crystallized something in my mind. "I'm going to let them go." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm done. With my parents, with Sophie, with everything. They've shown me exactly where I rank in their priorities, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter." Ethan had squeezed my hand. "I support whatever you decide. But are you certain? These are permanent decisions, Becky. They chose permanency when they stayed at that party when I was dying, and I'm only respecting their choice." The plan had gradually emerged over the following 2 weeks as I healed. I hadn't set out to hurt anyone or exact vengeance in any dramatic way. Instead, I decided to remove myself from their lives as cleanly and completely as possible, like removing a tumor. I'd started small, refusing to respond to my mother's texts and calls. When she complained to my father, who then called me, I answered once to tell him I was busy with recovery and would contact him when I was ready. 4 weeks following my surgery, Ethan and I had gone to Colorado to celebrate Thanksgiving with his parents, who had been more concerned about my health and one phone call than my own family had been throughout the whole. I'd ignored my mother's increasingly irritated messages demanding to know where I was and why I'd missed dinner without informing anyone. Christmas was the real test. My family had a tradition of gathering at my parents' house on Christmas Eve, a formal affair that had been sacred in the Matthews household for as long as I could remember. My mother had called me 2 weeks before Christmas to confirm my attendance, but I'd let it go to voicemail. Then I blocked her phone number, as well as my father's, Sophie's, and the handful of relatives who had begun contacting my mother on her behalf to inquire as to why I was being so difficult. The silence was immediate and complete, with no calls, texts, or emails. I had made myself unreachable. Ethan had asked me several times if I was sure about the decision, and I was. For the first time in my adult life, I'd felt light without the constant weight of their expectations and disappointments pressing down on me. I'd changed my phone number in January and hadn't given the new one to any family members yet. In February, I moved to a different apartment in Brooklyn that no one knew the address to. I blocked them on social media. I changed my emergency contact information at work and with my doctors, and by March, I'd effectively vanished from my family's life. I'd heard from Megan, who'd run into an old family friend, that my parents were initially confused, then annoyed, and finally bewildered by my absence. Apparently they drove to my old apartment building only to be told by the landlord that I had moved and left no forwarding address. They seem to think you've had some kind of breakdown, Megan had told me over coffee. Your mom was asking if I knew where you were, if you were okay, and she seemed to be worried about how it looked that her daughter had disappeared. I corrected her. She's not worried about me. Megan had carefully observed me. You really think you can keep this up forever? I don't know about forever, but I can keep it up as long as I need to. The fact was, I felt better than I had in years, and my work had improved since I wasn't continually distracted by family problems. My relationship with Ethan had deepened because I wasn't using him as an emotional buffer against my parents' criticism. I'd started running again, gradually rebuilding the strength I'd lost during my recovery, and I'd even taken up painting, which I'd loved in college but had abandoned because my mother thought it was a waste of time. 9 months had passed like that. I was at a conference in New York in late July, and I ran into one of James's cousins in the hotel elevator. She recognized me right away and launched into a sympathetic speech about how awful everything must be with my father, and how she hoped he would recover quickly. After 9 months of peace, autonomy, and freedom from the constant judgment I'd lived under my entire life, my father suffered a heart attack. I'd stood there in the elevator, trying to understand what she was saying. I'm sorry. What happened to my father? Her face had slumped. Oh God, you don't know. I assumed your family must have informed me. Informed me what? Your father had a heart attack 3 days ago and is at Mount Auburn Hospital. I just assumed you'd be there, or that someone would have called you. I got off the elevator on the wrong floor and spent 10 minutes in a hallway alcove staring at my phone. Of course they had tried to reach me, but I'd blocked all of their numbers months ago, and I'd been completely unreachable. The question was whether I cared. I called Ethan in New York. Ethan had said, "Do you want to see him?" I'd said, "He's my father. Regardless of everything else, he's still my father." He'd responded quickly, heard the tremor in my voice, and allowed me to explain my choice aloud. Or do you feel you should see him? Because those are two different things, Becca. I thought about the hospital room 9 months ago, about my parents arriving on day 3 with grocery store flowers, about my mother telling me I owed Sophie an apology while I was still recovering from nearly dying, and I admit I don't want to see him. I'd stayed in New York for the rest of the conference. I checked the news briefly and found a small article mentioning John Matthews, a prominent Boston attorney, who had suffered a cardiac episode but was in stable condition. I put my phone away and went to dinner with colleagues. I was happy that my father had survived, but I hadn't called them. A week later, I discovered a follow-up piece that stated he had had an emergency stent placed and was in stable condition, despite the fact that he had sustained major cardiac damage. In September, nearly a year after the gala that nearly killed me, I was at a restaurant in Cambridge with Ethan, celebrating my promotion to senior director. when I looked up from my menu and saw Sophie standing 3 tables away. Sophie had seen me at the exact same time. Her face had gone through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and anger, before she'd excused herself from her dinner companions and walked directly to our table. "Julia," her voice had been sharp enough to cut. "Where the hell have you been?" I'd set down my menu carefully. "Sophie, nice to see you." "Nice to see me. Are you kidding?" She'd kept her voice low, conscious of the other diners, but her rage was clear. "Dad had a heart attack, and you couldn't even be bothered to pay him a visit in the hospital. You blocked all of our phone numbers, so I didn't even know he had a heart attack. Mom and Dad have been searching for you for over a year. You cut us off completely, as if we meant nothing to you." Her hands were shaking. "What is wrong with you?" I'd looked at my sister, this person I'd grown up with and barely recognized anymore, and felt nothing but a distant sort of sadness. "I nearly died. Sophie on an operating table while you and Mom and Dad were at your party eating cake. That's not fair. We didn't know how serious it was. The ambulance said you were stable. I flatlined twice during surgery. The doctor said I came within minutes of dying, and no one from my family came to the hospital that night. I kept my voice steady. You texted me days later to apologize for the timing." Sophie flushed. I didn't know what to say. It was awkward. "It was awkward," I'd repeated. "My near-death experience was awkward for you. You're being unfair. Mom and Dad came to see you. They brought you flowers. 3 days later, after calling me melodramatic and suggesting I'd ruined your party on purpose, I picked up my water glass just to do something with my hands. You want to know what's wrong with me? Nothing. For the first time in my life, nothing is wrong with me. I'm well and happy, and I have people around me who truly care whether I live or die." "We care," Sophie had persisted, but the words had sounded empty. "You worry about how my absence affects you? That's not the same thing. So what? You're just never going to speak to us again? You're going to pretend you don't have a family?" "I'm not pretending anything. I'm simply choosing not to maintain relationships with people who've demonstrated that I don't matter to them unless I play the role they want me to play." Sophie had stood there for another moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she'd wanted to say something else but couldn't find the right words. Ethan had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" he had asked. "Yeah," I'd said, surprised to find that I meant it. "I really am." The final piece had come 3 months later, in November, almost exactly a year after the gala. I'd been at my apartment when someone buzzed from the lobby, and the doorman had called up to tell me that Catherine Matthews was there and wanted to see me. I almost told him to send her away, but something in his voice, some note of concern, had made me pause. "Is she all right? She seems quite distressed." "Miss Matthews, she's been crying." I told him to send her up, and I'd waited by the door of my apartment with my arms crossed and my defenses fully raised. My mother had looked smaller than I'd remembered. She was older. Her lipstick was stained from weeping, and she'd been gripping her purse like a lifeline. "Julia." Her voice had cracked on my name. "Please, can we talk?" I'd allowed her in, but hadn't offered her a seat. We'd stood in my entrance, 2 feet away but worlds apart. "Mom, what's wrong?" "It's your father. He had another episode yesterday. They don't think he has much time. His heart is failing." The shock was sudden and disorienting. I assumed he'd recovered. The article stated he was okay. He wasn't managing his medicine properly. He resumed working too many hours. I'd stood in my apartment, gazing at my mother weeping, trying to find any emotion in what she'd just told me. His heart was weakening, and she'd started crying in earnest yesterday. "Julia, please. He's begging for you. He wants to see you before that night when I was dying. Why didn't you come to the hospital?" My mother wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara even more. I was filled with sadness, grief, and anger because he had allowed his health to deteriorate. But the well from which I had drawn my entire life had run dry. "Julia, your father is dying, and I nearly died while you ate cake and posed for photos. So I'll ask again. Why didn't you come to the hospital?" She'd looked genuinely confused, as if she couldn't understand why I was bringing up something so obviously ancient and irrelevant. "The doctor said you were in surgery, and there was nothing we could have done. You could have been there when I woke up. You could have canceled the rest of the party, and you could have acted as if you cared even a little bit that your daughter might not survive the night." We did care, but Sophie also needed us, and the gala was more important than me, as you've made abundantly clear. My mother's face had hardened, some of her usual steel returning. "You've always been jealous of your sister, and even now, you can't let go of that petty resentment long enough to be there for your dying father. I'm not jealous of Sophie. I'm angry that my parents valued her party over my life. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. And the worst part is that you still don't believe you did anything wrong. Even now you're asking me to drop everything and come to Dad's bedside, and you can't understand why I might hesitate after you couldn't do the same for me. That's different. How? She'd opened her mouth, closed it and opened it again. You survived by chance? The surgeon told Ethan it could have gone either way. I survived despite your absence, not because of anything you did. So this is it? My mother's voice had turned bitter. You're going to let your father die without saying goodbye because you have a grudge against a party? It wasn't about the party, Mom. It was never about the party. It was about the fact that when I needed you the most, you chose something else. Someone else. And then you had the audacity to tell me I was being melodramatic and that I owed Sophie an apology. I was upset, and the entire evening had been ruined. My mother straightened her shoulders, her tears drying as her natural imperious nature reasserted itself. It didn't matter that I'd nearly died, that I'd been bleeding internally for days, or that you'd called me dramatic when I said I couldn't come. What mattered was that your plans had been disrupted. You've decided we're the villains in your story, and nothing I say will change that. But your father loves you, Julia, and he's dying. Can you really live with yourself if you don't say goodbye? I pondered that question for a long time, and the answer surprised me with its clarity. Yes, I said I could, since I had already said goodbye when I woke up in the ICU and realized none of you cared enough to be there. Anything else would be repeating myself. You'll regret this maybe, but it'll be my sorrow, not yours. My mother had departed without saying anything else. I'd watched from my window as she got into her car and drove away, waiting for the guilt or grief to hit me, but it never did. My father died 3 days later, according to an obituary in the Boston Globe, and the service was held at a church in Cambridge, with speeches from colleagues and family members. I'd read the whole thing, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, and feeling disconnected from the entire narrative. Ethan had been worried about me. Are you sure you're okay? It's normal to have complicated feelings about this. I'm sure I'm sad that he's gone. But I'm sad the way I'd feel about any person dying. Not about losing my father. I looked up at him. Does that make me a bad person? No. Sophie had gotten my new phone number, most likely from a mutual contact or an old colleague, and left a voicemail after the funeral. I'd listened to it once and she'd been sobbing, calling me heartless and cruel, accusing me of killing our father with my selfishness by not being there when he needed me the most. I erased the message without answering, and the months that followed were quiet. I'd pushed myself into work, gotten engaged to Ethan that spring, and begun planning a modest wedding for just close friends, creating a life that left no room for the family I'd been born into. A year after my father's death, nearly 1.5 years after the gala, I was walking through Boston Common when I saw my mother sitting on a bench, alone feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs, and she looked so diminished that I almost walked past without recognizing her. Most people were polite enough not to press for details, so I developed a simple response. We're not in contact. I sat alongside her, keeping a careful distance, and asked her how she was. She looked up as I approached, and our eyes connected. I saw her register who I was, and her face go through a dozen micro-expressions before landing on something that looked like resignation. I'm okay. Her voice had been quiet, lacking its usual sharp edges. How are you? I'm well. I got engaged. Congratulations, she'd said automatically and without inflection. To Ethan. Yes. We'd sat in silence for a while, watching the pigeons fight over breadcrumbs. Your sister got married last month. My mother had finally said, small ceremony, just family. So what's left of it? I hope she's happy. She is. James treats her well. Another pause. She occasionally asks about you. Does she? She feels bad about what happened, about everything. She should. My mother had turned to look at me then. Really? Look at me. Do you hate us? The question had remained in the air between us. I considered lying, saying something diplomatic, but settled on the truth instead. No, I don't hate you. I just don't need you anymore. That's worse somehow. She'd laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. Hate would at least mean we still mattered to you. You had a choice, Mom. Every single day, you had a choice about how to treat me, prioritize me, and show up for me. And every single time, you chose something else. Someone else. Eventually, I stopped waiting for you to choose me. I chose you because I'm your mother, and choosing me would have meant acting like it. She crumpled the empty bread bag in her hands. Your father had asked for you before he died. Did you know that? Not just that night when I came to your apartment in the hospital in those final hours. He kept saying your name. The information had landed without impact. I'm sorry he died wanting something I couldn't give him, but he taught me that lesson himself. People don't always get what they want, especially if they've spent years making it clear that someone doesn't matter to them. We never said you didn't matter. You didn't have to say it, Mom. You showed me over and over again. The gala was just the last confirmation of something I'd known my whole life. I don't know how to mend this. You can't. That's what I've been trying to tell you. There's nothing to fix because I'm not broken, I'm just done. So this is permanent. You're never coming back. I stood up, brushing invisible crumbs from my jeans. I'm not coming back because I was never really there to begin with. You were so busy polishing Sophie into the perfect daughter that you never noticed I'd left. Julia, I hope you have a good life, Mom. I genuinely mean that. I hope Sophie's marriage is happy, and you get grandchildren and all the things you wanted. I just won't be a part of it. I walked away there, leaving her on that bench, and I hadn't looked back. That was 4 years ago, and I'm 35 years old. I married Ethan in a ceremony at a vineyard in Napa Valley in front of 50 of our closest friends. We bought a house in Newton. I became a partner at my firm last year, and we're talking about starting a family. My life is full and rich and completely separate from the people who raised me, but sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. These thoughts usually come late at night when Ethan is asleep beside me and I'm scrolling through my phone, seeing other people's family photos and feeling that phantom ache where something used to be. But then I remember the hospital bracelet. I remember the cold of the operating table. I remember waking up and realizing that the people who were supposed to love me the most in the world had chosen a party over my life. And I remember that choosing myself was not a form of vengeance, punishment, or even a choice at all. It was survival. Last week I received a letter forwarded through my old law school address. It was from Sophie, written in her precise handwriting on expensive stationery, and she wanted me to know she was pregnant, due in January. She said she had been thinking about family and what it means, and how she wished things were different between us. She did not apologize. Not for the gala, not for the text about timing, not for anything. She just said she hoped that the baby could be a fresh start for all of us. I read the letter twice and then put it in a drawer with other artifacts from my old life, like my hospital discharge papers, my father's obituary, and the block numbers list that used to be my family contacts. Maybe someday I'll feel differently. In the years since I nearly died on that operating table, I've learned that you can't force people to care about you or make them prioritize you. Maybe someday the anger will subside, and I'll be able to meet my niece or nephew, but most likely not. You can't persuade them that you're important when they've already decided you don't. What you can do is accept who they are and what they're capable of giving you, and then decide if that's enough. For me it wasn't, so I chose silence, absence, and removing myself from an equation where I was always going to be the variable that didn't matter. Ethan asked me the other night if I ever regretted ghosting. We were cooking dinner together, moving around our kitchen in the synchronized way of people who've learned each other's rhythms, and he asked the question casually, as if he'd been thinking about it for a while. Do you ever wish you'd given them another chance? After your father died, when your mother contacted you, or now with Sophie's baby, I considered it while chopping vegetables for the salad. No, because another chance implies they deserved a first chance and squandered it. But they had hundreds of opportunities. Every day of my upbringing, every moment they decided to neglect me, favor Sophie, or make me feel like I was asking for too much by simply existing. The gala wasn't the beginning, it was just the conclusion. You don't believe people can change? I believe they can, but I'm not sure my family wanted to. They wanted me to go back to accepting whatever scraps they were willing to offer and being grateful for it. I'd set down a knife and turned to face it. I'm happier now than I've ever been. Doesn't that tell you something? He drew me into a hug, careful and gentle like he'd been that day in the ICU. It tells me you made the right choice, and most days I absolutely believe that. But there are still moments when I see a mother and daughter shopping together and laughing, or I watch a family reunion video on social media, or I hear someone casually mention Sunday dinner at their parents' house, and I feel the loss of something I never really had but always wanted. I mourn for the family I should have had. The parents who would have rushed to the hospital and held my hand through the fear. The sister who would have canceled her party to be with me. Its ability to survive trauma and heal itself, even when the damage appeared catastrophic. I like to think I've done the same thing emotionally. The trauma of being unloved by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally nearly destroyed me, but I cut out the infected parts, gave myself time to heal, and rebuilt something stronger in its place. My phone has been silent for 4 years. There were no calls from blocked numbers, no letters, except Sophie's pregnancy announcement, no surprise visits or dramatic confrontations. They'd finally realized that I meant what I said, that I wasn't bluffing, throwing a tantrum, or waiting for them to grovel enough to earn my forgiveness. I was simply done. Here's the thing about being done. It's not dramatic, it's not vengeance, it's not even particularly satisfying in the way you might expect. It's just peace. I don't lie awake at night fantasizing about scenarios in which they finally understand what they did to me. I don't fantasize about them suffering the same way I did, learning through their own pain what it's like to be abandoned when you need someone the most. I suppose my father's heart attack gave them a taste of that. My mother reaching out to me in desperation, my phone remaining silent, her having to accept the fact that I wasn't coming no matter how much she needed me to. But I didn't orchestrate it, I didn't plan it, and I didn't even feel particularly vindicated when I found out about it later. I just felt nothing, and maybe that's the true revenge, if you want to call it that. I've grown entirely apathetic to whether my family suffers or flourishes, struggles or succeeds, lives or dies. I don't hate them enough to hurt them, but neither do I love them enough to rescue them. When I get pregnant and hold my child for the first time, I know I'll think about my parents, how they failed me, and how I'll work every day not to fail my own children. Strangers who happen to share my DNA and last name in my childhood home, but strangers nonetheless. Ethan and I are currently trying for a baby. I'll teach my children that they matter, that their pain is real and valid, that when they say they're hurting, I'll believe them instead of dismissing them as dramatic, that no party, event, or social obligation will ever be more important than their well-being, and that I'll do all of this without ever meeting their grandchildren. Perhaps this makes me cruel. In the future, my children may wonder why they don't have grandparents on my side. And I'll have to explain that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes biology doesn't trump boundaries, and that the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you. But I believe they'll understand because I'll raise them in a home where understanding comes naturally, where their feelings are respected, and where they never have to choose between being heard. And the other day, I was cleaning out my closet and discovered the champagne-colored dress I'd worn to the gala, the one that had been ruined with blood. I'd kept it for some reason, shoved it in the back of a garment bag and forgotten about it until my hand landed on the familiar fabric. I pulled it out and looked at it for a long time. The stains had set permanently, dark rust-colored patches across the silk. It was unwearable, unsalvageable, and I threw it in the trash without hesitation. Some things can't be cleaned, repaired, or made beautiful again. Some damage is too fundamental, too deep, and the only option is to let it go and move on to something new. That dress isn't a metaphor, but maybe it is. Either way, it's gone and I'm still here. I'm still here, living a life that my family will never see, creating a future they will never see, and becoming a person they will never truly know. And I'm fine with that. In fact, I'm happy because choosing myself gave me the freedom to become someone I actually enjoy. So, no. I don't feel guilty. I don't lie awake at night wondering if I should have tried harder, forgiven more readily, or given them the chances they never deserved. I simply move on. My life is proof that you can not only survive, but even thrive, when you are unloved by your family. They wanted me to need them, and they expected me to eventually miss them enough to forget what had happened. You can construct something greater from the debris of shattered relationships and unmet expectations. All you have to do is be willing to let go. I let go 4 years ago on an operating table when I flatlined twice and no one from my family noticed, and I've been free since.